London, 1783. A desperate father steals a single loaf of bread to feed his starving children. Within hours, he stands before a judge who sentences him to death for theft worth less than 5 shillings. But here is the twist that will shock you. Death was actually the merciful option. What I am about to reveal will completely destroy everything you thought you knew about British civilization. Behind those powdered wigs and fancy courtrooms was a system so twisted, so deliberately cruel, that it makes medieval torture chambers look like summer camp. You think you know the British Empire? The same empire that claimed moral superiority over the world while building the largest empire in human history? Well, buckle up, because what they actually did to maintain control will haunt you long after this video ends. For over 300 years, Britain operated something historians call the Bloody Code. And it was not just harsh, it was organized sadism wrapped in legal procedure. Today, we are diving deep into 6 punishment methods that reveal the dark truth about how Britain really controlled a quarter of the world population. Subscribe and hit that like button if you are ready to uncover what British textbooks desperately hope you will never learn. And let me know in the comments where you are watching from, because chances are your ancestors lived under this system of terror. The Bloody Code, when everything became a death sentence. Before we explore these horrific punishments, you need to understand the legal framework that made Britain the most violent judicial system in world history. The Bloody Code was not just tough on crime. It was a systematic death machine that would make Stalin blush. By 1760, over 200 crimes carried the death penalty. Stealing goods worth more than 5 shillings? Death. Cutting down someone's tree? Death. Being found on a road with a blackened face? Death. And here is what will blow your mind. These were not ancient barbaric laws. These were modern statutes passed by educated parliamentarians who genuinely believed mass execution was the key to social order. Picture this nightmare. Children as young as 7 could be sentenced to death for pickpocketing. A hungry person stealing food faced the same punishment as a cold-blooded murderer. One family member's minor theft could destroy an entire household. But here is where it gets truly insidious. The architects of this system were not accidentally cruel. Sir William Blackstone, the era's most respected legal scholar, openly argued that making hundreds of crimes punishable by death would terrorize people into absolute obedience. This was not justice. It was psychological warfare disguised as law. The numbers are staggering. Between 1770 and 1830, Britain executed more people per capita than any other European nation. Working-class defendants made up over 90% of victims, while wealthy criminals often escaped through legal loopholes and royal pardons. Justice was not blind. It was bought and paid for. And here is the kicker. Simple execution was considered merciful. The real horrors began when authorities wanted to send a message that would echo through generations. Drawing and quartering, the ultimate horror show. When Britain wanted to demonstrate absolute power, they created the most elaborate execution method in human history. Drawing and quartering was not just capital punishment. It was systematic destruction of the human body designed as a spectacle so horrific that witnesses would never forget. This barbaric ritual was reserved for high treason, but here is what they did not teach you in school. Treason was defined so broadly it could include counterfeiting coins, corresponding with foreign contacts, or even expressing the wrong religious beliefs. Let me walk you through Guy Fawkes' execution in 1606, because what happened to him reveals the calculated cruelty behind this punishment. Picture yourself in a crowd of thousands gathered at Westminster, promised a demonstration of royal justice they would never forget. First, the condemned traitor was dragged through cobblestone streets on a wooden hurdle behind horses. This journey lasted hours, designed to ensure the victim arrived at the execution site already bloodied and terrorized, while crowds hurled objects and screamed abuse. At the scaffold, the real nightmare began. The victim was hanged by the neck, but here is the crucial detail. They were cut down while still alive and conscious. Timing was everything. The hanging had to be brief enough to avoid death, but long enough to cause partial strangulation that would weaken resistance. While the victim was still aware, the executioner would cut open the abdomen and remove intestines and organs, often burning them before the victim's eyes. The castration that followed served both practical and symbolic purposes, destroying masculinity while ensuring the bloodline died with the traitor. Only after this systematic mutilation would death finally come through decapitation. But even death did not end the punishment. The body was carefully dismembered into 4 quarters following specific anatomical procedures developed by professional executioners who traveled the empire, perfecting their craft. Here is where it gets truly macabre. These body parts served political purposes. The head was displayed on London Bridge, where thousands saw it daily. The 4 quarters were sent to different cities throughout the realm, often the victim's hometown, serving as warnings to anyone considering opposition. The preservation techniques reveal the systematic nature of this horror. Heads and quarters were parboiled and treated with tar to prevent decay, allowing them to serve as warnings for months or even years in specially constructed iron cages that became tourist attractions. The psychological impact extended far beyond immediate victims. The knowledge that challenging royal authority could result in such systematic destruction created a climate of terror that influenced political behavior throughout the empire. Private conversations about royal policies carried risks few were willing to take, gibbeting rotting in chains as living billboards. While most executions ended with death, Britain developed something far more psychologically devastating. Gibbeting, where criminals were left to die slowly in iron cages suspended from tall posts, becoming living advertisements of imperial justice as they starved, dehydrated, and rotted in public view. Imagine driving down a country road in 18th century England and seeing human figures hanging in metal frameworks at crossroads, some still moving weakly, others reduced to bones and rags. These were not just dead bodies. Many were prisoners sentenced to die slowly while entire communities watched their gradual decomposition. The gibbet itself was an engineering marvel of cruelty. Custom-made iron frameworks were shaped to each victim's body, with metal bands securing the torso, arms, and legs. The cage design ensured the dying criminal remained visible while preventing escape or suicide. Some victims survived up to 3 weeks, crying out for water while local residents went about their daily business. Captain William Kidd's gibbeting in 1701 demonstrates the calculated nature of this punishment. After his execution for piracy, Kidd's body was suspended in chains at Tilbury Point, where it remained for over 20 years. Ships entering the Thames passed directly beneath his rotting corpse, sending a clear message to any sailor considering a life of crime. The location selection was strategic. Gibbets were positioned at prominent crossroads, harbor entrances, and market towns where maximum numbers of people would witness the gradual decay. Local magistrates often chose sites near the criminal's hometown, ensuring that family members and former associates would regularly confront the consequences of illegal behavior. What made gibbeting particularly cruel was its impact on local communities. Children walked past these rotting corpses daily on their way to school. Merchants conducted business within sight and smell of decomposing bodies. The psychological trauma extended far beyond the immediate victim to terrorize entire populations. Contemporary records describe the horrific conditions. Bodies attracted ravens and insects that would strip flesh while victims were still alive. Summer heat accelerated decomposition, creating unbearable stenches that could be detected from miles away. Winter weather preserved corpses longer, extending the visual impact for years. The British government's gibbet records reveal systematic planning behind this punishment. Between 1752 and 1832, over 300 criminals were sentenced to gibbeting across England alone. The Admiralty maintained detailed logs of maritime gibbets, noting wind patterns and tidal schedules to maximize visibility to passing ships. Dr. Samuel Johnson, the famous lexicographer, wrote extensively about gibbeting's psychological effects on witnesses. His private correspondence describes communities living in constant fear, with children developing chronic nightmares and adults avoiding certain roads to escape, confronting the suspended corpses. The Cat of Nine Tails, scientific scarring. When the Royal Navy needed to maintain discipline among sailors pressed into service against their will, they developed an instrument of torture that would leave men permanently scarred while keeping them functional enough to serve the Empire. Picture yourself pressed into naval service, trapped on a ship with no escape. You have been accused of speaking back to an officer, a crime carrying 50 lashes. You are dragged to the main deck while the entire crew watches, understanding they are witnessing their potential fate. The Cat of Nine Tails consisted of 9 separate leather strands, each 3 feet long, attached to a wooden handle. But what made this weapon particularly horrific was its scientific construction. The strands were weighted with lead shot or knotted at intervals to ensure maximum tissue damage. Some versions included metal barbs designed to tear flesh with each strike, creating wounds that would never fully heal. The flogging procedure followed strict military protocols designed to maximize both physical damage and psychological impact. The victim was stripped and tied to a wooden grating with arms stretched overhead. A drummer beat rhythm for the lashes, ensuring consistent timing that prolonged the ordeal, while the ship's surgeon monitored vital signs to prevent premature death. Royal Navy records reveal the systematic nature of these punishments. Ship logs meticulously documented the number of lashes, specific offenses, and victim conditions afterward. Captain James Cook's logs from his Pacific voyages detail over 200 floggings during a single expedition, with punishments ranging from 12 lashes for drunkenness to 300 for attempted mutiny. Dr. William Smellie, a naval surgeon, documented the medical effects in his private journals. He described tissue damage extending far beyond surface wounds. Deep lacerations, severing muscle fibers, damaging nerve endings, and creating permanent disabilities. Many victims developed chronic pain lasting decades after service, with some unable to wear shirts due to hypersensitive scar tissue. But here is what reveals the true sadism. The punishment created permanent reminders of imperial authority. Cat of Nine Tails scarring was distinctive and indelible. Survivors carried these marks for life, serving as walking advertisements of what happened to those opposing British authority. Tavern keepers could identify former sailors by their scarred backs, creating a permanent underclass marked by their resistance to naval discipline. The psychological conditioning was equally important. Entire ship crews witnessed these punishments, understanding clearly that similar fate awaited anyone challenging the rigid hierarchy of imperial power. The sound of leather striking flesh, victims' screams, and pooling blood created lasting trauma for witnesses and victims alike. Colonial administrators adapted the Cat of Nine Tails throughout the empire. Caribbean plantation overseers used modified versions to control enslaved populations. Military commanders in India employed similar instruments for colonial troops. Australian prison wardens used systematic flogging to break transported convicts' spirits, with some prisoners receiving over 1,000 lashes in their lifetimes. Transportation slowed death in paradise. When British courts wanted to destroy lives without execution, expense, and spectacle, they developed transportation, a punishment combining exile with systematic brutality while maintaining the fiction that convicts received rehabilitation opportunities in distant colonies. Between 1770 and 1868, Britain transported over 160,000 convicted criminals to Australia alone, with thousands more sent to American colonies and Caribbean islands. These were not voluntary emigrants seeking opportunities, but prisoners forced into voyages many would not survive, and conditions designed to destroy those who did. Picture yourself sentenced to transportation for stealing workplace tools, a crime carrying 7 years' exile to New South Wales. You are chained in a transport ship's hold with hundreds of other convicts, breathing air so foul that prisoners vomit constantly while respiratory infections spread rapidly through overcrowded space. The voyage was designed to break prisoners' spirits before reaching destinations. Convicts remained in irons throughout journeys lasting 8 months, with minimal food, contaminated water, and no medical care for sick or injured. Ship captains were paid per convict delivered alive, creating perverse incentives to keep prisoners breathing while spending minimally on welfare. Death rates reveal this cruelty's systematic nature. On average, 15 to 20% of transported convicts died during voyages, with some ships losing over half their human cargo to disease, malnutrition, and deliberate neglect. The transport ship Neptune lost 158 of 502 convicts during a single 1790 voyage, with survivors arriving skeletal and disease-ridden. Dr. John White, a naval surgeon accompanying the First Fleet to Australia, documented conditions defying human comprehension. His private journals describe prisoners chained in spaces so small they could not stand or lie fully, forced to relieve themselves where they sat, developing ulcers and infections from prolonged contact with waste. Upon colonial arrival, transported convicts faced conditions often worse than the voyage. They were assigned to masters who could work them without pay for sentence duration, essentially creating slavery disguised as criminal punishment. Colonial records document systematic abuse, including starvation, flogging, and forced labor in conditions killing thousands. Female convicts faced additional horrors specifically designed to exploit vulnerability. Transportation ships carrying women often became floating environments for systematic assault, with officers and crew having unrestricted access to female prisoners lacking legal protection or recourse. The ship, Lady Juliana, carrying 226 women to Australia in 1790, became notorious as a floating brothel where pregnant convicts gave birth in chains. The assignment system in colonies like Australia created systematic abuse opportunities, extending far beyond official punishment terms. Masters could extend sentences for minor infractions, ensuring convicts remained unpaid laborers for years beyond original terms. Norfolk Island, Australia's most notorious penal settlement, became known as Hell on Earth, where prisoners begged to be executed rather than continue their sentences in what officials called rehabilitation opportunities. Margaret Catchpole, transported for horse theft in 1801, documented the psychological impact of transportation in letters smuggled back to England. She described convicts developing mental breakdowns from isolation, with many attempting suicide rather than completing their sentences in what officials called rehabilitation opportunities, pressing to death the silence of stones. When British courts encountered prisoners refusing to plead guilty or innocent to criminal charges, they employed punishment so psychologically sophisticated it represented the ultimate expression of legal sadism. Pressing to death, legally known as peine forte et dure, extracted pleas through systematic torture while maintaining the fiction that defendants chose their fate through continued silence. The legal logic was elegantly cruel. If defendants refused pleas, they could not be tried, convicted, or have property confiscated by the Crown. But they could not be released, either. Pressing created situations where prisoners faced increasingly unbearable torture until they either entered pleas or died without confession, allowing families to inherit property that would otherwise be forfeit. Imagine being accused of witchcraft in Salem or highway robbery in 18th century England. Pleading guilty means certain execution, while pleading innocent means a rigged trial where a conviction is virtually guaranteed. Your only hope of protecting family inheritance is remaining silent and enduring whatever punishment courts inflict to force speech. The pressing procedure followed specific protocols designed to maximize psychological pressure while maintaining legal fiction that defendants could end suffering any time by simply entering pleas. The condemned was stripped, laid on a wooden board, and covered with another board upon which stones were placed one by one. What made pressing particularly horrific was duration and deliberate choice it forced upon victims. Unlike quick execution methods, pressing could last days as weight gradually increased. At any moment, victims could end suffering by speaking guilty or innocent, but doing so meant accepting either certain death or rigged trials. Weight placement followed scientific principles designed to maximize pressure on vital organs while avoiding immediate death that would end psychological torture. Stones were positioned to compress chest and abdomen in ways making breathing increasingly difficult while creating crushing pressure on internal organs. Contemporary accounts describe psychological breakdown typically occurring during pressing. Giles Corey, pressed to death in Salem in 1692, reportedly survived 2 days under increasing weight before dying without entering a plea. Witnesses described his increasingly desperate breathing attempts, while maintaining stubborn silence protecting family property rights. The audience requirements created additional psychological pressure on victims and witnesses. Family members were sometimes required to watch relatives being slowly crushed while having power to end suffering by convincing them to enter pleas. This created emotional torture, extending far beyond immediate victims. Margaret Clitheroe, pressed to death in York in 1586 for harboring Catholic priests, became a martyr whose execution backfired on authorities. Her courage under torture inspired other Catholics to resist persecution, forcing the government to abandon pressing as counterproductive to maintaining religious conformity. The Scavenger's Daughter engineering human compression. Deep in the Tower of London, British authorities developed torture devices representing the pinnacle of systematic cruelty disguised as judicial investigation. The Scavenger's Daughter was specifically designed to compress human bodies into positions, causing excruciating pain, while leaving no permanent marks that might embarrass officials if victims survived. Named after Sir Leonard Skevington, a Tower lieutenant under Henry VIII, this device solved a practical problem: how to torture prisoners for information while maintaining the legal fiction that Britain was civilized and did not engage in barbaric torture practices. The solution was elegant in its cruelty. Imagine being accused of treason against the crown, perhaps caught corresponding with Catholic conspirators, or overheard expressing Irish independence sympathy. You are brought to the Tower and led down stone steps into chambers where flickering torches cast dancing shadows on walls stained with previous victims' bodily fluids. The Scavenger's Daughter consisted of an iron frame, forcing victims into sitting positions with legs folded against chest and arms wrapped around knees. Iron bands were then tightened to compress bodies into increasingly compact positions, creating pressure eventually causing blood to flow from nose, ears, and sometimes fingernails. What made this device particularly insidious was medical precision. Unlike crude torture methods causing immediate death or obvious permanent injury, the Scavenger's Daughter created maximum pain while preserving victims' survival ability and potential confession capability to whatever crimes interrogators wanted to hear. Compression torture could be applied in graduated degrees, allowing interrogators to increase pressure systematically until achieving desired results. Tower records document sessions lasting hours, during which pressure increased incrementally while questions were repeated and victims given confession opportunities before additional compression. Contemporary accounts describe psychological effects as devastating as physical pain. Victims reported feeling their bodies being crushed from all directions simultaneously, creating panic responses, often leading to confessions of crimes they had never committed simply to make torture stop. Dr. John Gerard, a Jesuit priest who survived Tower torture, provided detailed first-hand accounts of the Scavenger's Daughter's effects. He described compression, creating pressure on internal organs, making breathing extremely difficult, while positioning prevented any movement that might provide relief from crushing sensation. The device was used throughout the 16th and 17th centuries as British authorities sought to extract confessions from religious dissidents, political prisoners, and suspected traitors. Tower records show most Scavenger's Daughter victims eventually confessed to whatever charges were brought, though many later recanted statements when no longer under torture. Anne Askew, a Protestant reformer tortured in the Tower in 1546, became the only woman on record to be tortured there. Her experience with the scavenger's daughter was so severe that she had to be carried to her execution, unable to walk due to internal injuries sustained during compression torture. The Empire's dark legacy exposed. These 6 punishment methods reveal the true foundation upon which the British Empire built global dominance. Systematic terror disguised as civilized justice. The Bloody Code created legal frameworks for mass execution, while gibbeting turned corpses into permanent billboards of imperial power. The Cat of Nine Tails scarred bodies as lifelong reminders of resistance consequences. Drawing and quartering created spectacles of systematic dismemberment, horrifying witnesses across centuries. Transportation disguised slavery as criminal punishment, while building colonial infrastructure through unpaid labor. The scavenger's daughter compressed human bodies with scientific precision, while pressing to death tortured victims psychologically, while maintaining legal fiction of free choice. What makes these practices particularly disturbing is not just individual cruelty, but integration into legal and social systems, portraying systematic brutality as evidence of civilized superiority. These were not aberrations or temporary crisis responses, but fundamental imperial governance aspects, persisting for centuries and influencing legal development throughout the British colonial world. The scale of suffering created by these punishment methods defies comprehension. Hundreds of thousands died through systematic judicial murder. Millions more were scarred, exiled, or terrorized into submission through legal procedures designed to maximize human suffering while maintaining imperial control over subject populations. The psychological conditioning achieved through these punishments created fear cultures, influencing behavior throughout British society and colonial territories. Children grew up understanding that challenging authority could result in systematic destruction of bodies and minds, while families were forced to watch and suffer alongside them. Understanding this history provides crucial insight into how systematic cruelty becomes normalized within societies failing to maintain appropriate moral boundaries. The British Empire demonstrates how legal frameworks, religious justification, and cultural tradition can combine, creating environments where extreme abuse becomes celebrated as evidence of civilized advancement. If this exploration of imperial punishment methods disturbed you as much as it did me, make sure to subscribe for more content uncovering brutal realities behind civilized appearances. Comment below letting me know which of these 6 methods you found most shocking, and what other dark chapters of imperial history you would like explored. These historical practices remind us that the most dangerous cruelty forms often operate within legal frameworks, claiming moral justification. The British Empire's systematic punishment legacy serves as a warning about what happens when power becomes unchecked and societies lose sight of basic human dignity in pursuit of order and control.